In the last video we talked about the beginning of the universe and ended with Zeus rescuing his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. He also freed the Cyclopes and the Centaurs from the Tartarus, in exchange for help against Cronus. Now let's continue with the events of this war. Some titans took Zeus' side, notably Prometheus and Hermes. You may be wondering, why would a titan betray their own kind and take the side of the gods instead? Well, there's a reason for this. Prometheus was a titan who had the power of seeing the future, so he probably foresaw the outcome of the war and took the winner's side, a smart move, honestly. Hermes, on the other hand, was a titan that represented the balance of the universe, and Cronus, having become a tyrannic leader, had broken this balance, so she took the god's side in order to restore it. Let's take a look at the course of the war. The gods ruled from Mount Olympus, which is why they are also known as the Olympians, while the titans ruled from Mount Othrys. Both are real mountains located in Greece. Furthermore, Mount Olympus is the highest mountain there, so it made sense to think that the gods lived there. Once the Cyclopes were already free, they used their skills as blacksmiths to craft weapons for the gods. They gave Zeus his most representative and powerful weapon, the lightning. They also crafted a trident capable of shaking the earth and dividing the seas for Poseidon, and finally, a helmet, which granted invisibility, for Hades. Additionally, the Centaurs used massive rocks that they hurled with their 100 arms as weapons against the Titans. This war was very close, but finally, the Olympic side won after 10 years of battling, and the Titans were locked in the Tartarus, and guarded by the Centaurs to ensure they could never escape. Nevertheless, not all Titans shared the same destiny. Prometheus and Hermes were granted a place in the Olympus because of their help, and others weren't punished because of their neutrality. But there was a titan who had the worst destiny of all titans, Atlas, Prometheus' brother. He served as one of the most important and powerful on the Titanic side, being also a military leader. His punishment was holding the sky for the rest of eternity, so it would never fuse again with the earth, as we mentioned in the last video. This way, the balance of the universe could be maintained. After that, as usual after the end of a war, the winner established a new order. Zeus and his brothers decided their domains by drawing lots. Zeus became the ruler of the sky and king of gods, Poseidon ruled the sea, and Hades the underworld. Zeus began his reign by marrying his sister Hera, goddess of marriage. But it is important to mention that Zeus had already had an affair with Metis, but it was prophetic that if Metis had a male child he would become more powerful than him and overthrow him. To avoid this, Zeus tricked Metis to turn into a fly, in what seemed an exhibition of power between them, and when she did, she ate her. All this before his marriage with Hera. Zeus tried to seduce Hera, but she didn't let him because of his past relationship. So he turned into a tiny wounded bird, and Hera tried to help him. When she did, Zeus went back into his normal form and declared her his love. This way, they ended up married. Their wedding was the most magnificent event you can imagine. Gaia gifted them with golden apples that symbolized fertility, and the gods celebrated for 300 years. After that, Zeus and Hera had his first child, Hephaestus, but when Hera saw that he was deformed, he threw him from Mount Olympus without Zeus even knowing they had had a son. Afterwards they had a second child, Ares, god of violent war. Unlike his brother, he was instantly accepted into the Olympus. After a while, when Ares had already grown up, Hera received a throne as a present, but when she sat on it, it trapped her. She was enchained to it and couldn't escape. Zeus tried to free her, but couldn't, so he desperately announced that whoever freed his wife could marry Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, even though she and Ares were already in love. Poseidon and Ares tried to accomplish the mission because they wanted Aphrodite, but neither of them could. Suddenly, a man with a limp came to the Olympus, revealing himself as Hephaestus, who raised inside a volcano became the god of forge. He was the one that had sent the throne as a revenge against his mother. He said that he could free her, under the condition that he married Aphrodite and was accepted as an Olympian. Zeus agreed, Hera was freed and Hephaestus was granted his place in Olympus, and his marriage with Aphrodite was officialized against her will. Time passed, and one day Zeus woke up with a terrible headache. All gods tried to help him but couldn't. Then Hephaestus came and struck Zeus in the head with an axe, cutting it open. From there emerged a young woman wearing full armor. It resulted that Metis had given birth to Athena inside of Zeus' body and crafted her an armor there. Athena was the goddess of intelligence and strategic war. But she came alone from Zeus' head, so where was Métis? In order to try and help everyone, she stayed inside of Zeus' head to give him advice. Let's continue with the rest of Zeus' offspring that would later be part of Olympus. Zeus fell in love with a titan called Leto, and got her pregnant. This made Hera furious and she cursed Leto, so she couldn't give birth anywhere on Earth. She also sent Python, Gaia's huge snake, to torment her during her pregnancy. She was desperate to find somewhere to give birth because she was in terrible pain, and she remembered Delos, an island floating above the sea. She went there but couldn't get there, so Poseidon took pity on her and raised the sea level so she could give birth. There, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, was born, and just after, she helped his mother to give birth to Apollo, her twin and god of the sun and prophecy. The siblings weren't accepted at first in the Olympus and lived roaming the earth. Continuing with Zeus' affairs, he had one with a nymph called Maia. Afraid of Hera's reaction, she gave birth to Hermes, the god of thieves and slyness, in a cave. His mother was exhausted after her labor, but Hermes left the cave and went for a walk. He found some cows, so in order to bring them to the cave without being tracked, he tied leaves to his feet so he wouldn't leave footprints, and made the cows walk backwards to mislead anyone who tried to follow their footprints. When he made it back to the cave, her mother was amazed by his intelligence despite being a newborn. However, there still was a huge problem. The cows he had stolen were Apollo's, and they weren't ordinary cows. They were divine animals, regarded as sacred. And Hermes had killed 2 of these cows and a turtle, and from the turtle's shell and the cow's intestines he invented the lyre. Apollo, furious, started seeking the perpetrator, and using his prophetical skills he found the cave and confronted Hermes. In exchange for his forgiveness, he gave Apollo the lyre, and he liked it so much that it became one of his symbols, and he now was also the god of music. Apollo also received the rest of his cows back and forged a strong friendship with Hermes. Zeus, amazed by his son, granted him a place in Olympus, named him Messenger of the Gods, and gave him a present, the caduceus, a golden staff with intertwined snakes. Even Hera didn't dislike him because his mother was a modest nymph. He was useful for her as a messenger, and he gained her sympathy with his slyness. And finally, let's move on to the story of the last member of the Olympians. Before this, I want to clarify that in future videos I may talk about things that happen chronologically before some of these gods, but I prefer to introduce all the main gods and then continue in a linear story. For instance, the creation of humans, I will talk about it in my next video, but this last god is the son of a human, so you may be asking, how come you are talking about humans if they haven't yet been created? So I wanted to clarify it for you. Now let's go back to our story. There was a priestess in the city of Thebes. She was called Semele, and his father was the king Cadmus. Zeus fell in love with her and promised her to grant her any wish she wanted. He swore it upon the river Styx. This kind of promise was so powerful that if a god broke it, he would fall into a coma for 9 years. This made Hera terribly jealous, so she disguised herself as an elderly woman, and convinced Selene to tell Zeus to show himself to her in his real form. When a god appeared in front of a human, they took a humanoid form because it is said that humans couldn't bear seeing their true aspect and would die instantly. So Selene did it, and as Zeus promised her to grant her anything she wished for, he revealed himself in his true form, and Selene died while being pregnant. Zeus rescued the unborn baby and sewed it to his thigh until it was ready to be born. So it was commonly said that he was the god that had been born twice. His name was Dionysus and was the god of wine and theater. First he was persecuted by Hera, but once Hestia, goddess of hearth and sacred fire, left the Olympus as a symbol of modesty and to take care of the fire of every home, Dionysus became the 12th and last Olympian, closing the Greek pantheon. Let's revise who these gods were. Zeus, king of gods. Hera, queen of gods. Demeter, goddess of agriculture. Poseidon, god of the seas. Hephaestus, god of the forge. Ares, god of violent war. Apollo, god of the sun, prophecy, and arts. Artemis, goddess of hunt. Aphrodite, goddess of beauty. Athena, goddess of intelligence and strategic war. Hermes, god of the thieves and slyness. And Dionysus, god of wine and theater. Sadly, Hades wasn't included on this list because the ruler of the underworld had to stay there. And here concludes the introduction of the main characters of this Greek story. If you enjoyed the video and are curious about how humans were created and the myth of Pandora's box, subscribe so you won't miss my next video.